Hello, and welcome back to The Complete Pilgrim. Today, in commemoration of Queen Elizabeth II, I want to talk about English and British monarchs, specifically where they are buried. On September 8, 2022, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary of the House of Windsor, better known as Queen Elizabeth II, passed away at the age of 96. She sat on the throne for 70 years, the longest reigning monarch in English or British history. She is to be laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Which brings up an interesting question. Where exactly are all of the other monarchs of this ancient kingdom buried, and can their tombs be seen today? Before we answer this, a little background. For the purposes of this video, we are looking at all of the monarchs of England and Great Britain, starting with Alfred the Great in the 9th century, and ending with Elizabeth II. Those monarchs whose reigns are considered disputed, such as Jane Grey, have not been included. All told, there were 57 former ruling kings and queens of England and Britain buried throughout Europe, and finding all of these resting places can be a bit of a scavenger hunt. So where to begin? The obvious answer, of course, is London. The Collegiate Church of St. Peter at Westminster, better known as Westminster Abbey, is one of the great sights of London. Millions of people visit every year, in large part due to the exceptional number of high-profile burials in the church. 16 English monarchs are entombed here, mostly from the houses of Plantagenet, Tudor, and Stuart. Among the better-known monarchs buried here are Edward the Confessor, the last Saxon king of England, who began the construction of Westminster Abbey; Edward I, also known as the Longshanks, made famous by the film Braveheart; James I, who commissioned the creation of the King James Bible; Edward VI, the namesake prince of the story The Prince and the Pauper; and Elizabeth I, who sponsored the creation of the first overseas colonies of the British Empire. A 17th monarch, Edward V, might also be buried here. One of the two little princes who disappeared in 1483, an urn in the abbey is believed to hold the bones of the 12-year-old Edward, who ruled for only 2.5 months. Two other English monarchs were buried elsewhere in London: Ethelred the Unready at Old St. Paul's Cathedral, and Harold I at St. Clement Danes. Both of these churches were destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666, and the remains of both of these kings were lost. A few miles west of London is Windsor Castle, one of the royal residences. St. George's Chapel, on the grounds of the castle, has the country's second largest number of royal burials. 11 kings and queens are buried here, including most of the more recent monarchs of Great Britain. Among the better known are Henry VIII, known for transforming England into an important European power, breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church, and for his 6 wives; George III, of American Revolution fame; George VI, whose inspirational story was featured in the film The King's Speech; and by the time you see this video, Elizabeth II. Also in the city of Windsor, at the nearby estate of Frogmore, are the Royal Mausoleum, where Queen Victoria is buried along with her husband Albert, and the Royal Burial Ground, where Edward VIII, who famously abdicated in order to marry an American divorcee, is buried. South Central England, the country's ancient historic heartland, is dotted with churches and abbeys where many of England's earliest monarchs are, or were, buried. Most notably is Winchester Cathedral, where 5 kings from as far back as the 10th century are interred. Among these is Canute the Great, who ruled over England, Denmark, and Norway. The remains of all 5 are now kept in mortuary chests. Also in Winchester was Hyde Abbey, an ancient monastery where England's first 2 kings, Alfred the Great and Edward the Elder, were buried. Sadly, the abbey was destroyed on several occasions, and the remains of both of these kings are now considered lost. Between Winchester and London are 2 more royal burials. The Church of St. Edward the Martyr in Brookwood holds the relic of Edward the Martyr, an early king of England who is now regarded as a saint in some Christian denominations. Reading Abbey, in the city of Reading, is home to the tomb of Henry I. Glastonbury Abbey, once one of England's most magnificent monasteries, was the burial site of three ancient kings: Edmund I, Edgar the Peaceful, and Edmund II. The abbey was destroyed in the 16th century on the orders of Henry VIII, and all three bodies are now considered lost. Tradition also holds that Glastonbury was the site of the burial of the legendary King Arthur. A memorial marks the location of his purported burial among the ruins. There are 7 more churches scattered around England that are also home to the tombs of kings. Henry IV is buried in the cathedral at Canterbury. Stephen is buried in the abbey at Faversham. Harold II is buried in the abbey church at Waltham. Ethelstan, England's 3rd king, is buried in the abbey at Malmesbury. And Edward II is buried in the cathedral of Gloucester. Interestingly, 2 of England's most notorious kings are buried the longest distance from London. Richard III, who is generally regarded as a ruthless ruler and who, among other things, is believed to have been responsible for the murder of the little princes, was killed in battle near Leicester in 1485. His remains were discovered and positively identified in the 2010s and reinterred in Leicester Cathedral. John Lackland, better known as Prince John, was one of the chief villains of the Robin Hood legend. As king, he aroused the ire of his nobles, who forced him to issue the famous Magna Carta. His tomb can be found at Worcester Cathedral. The tombs of England's 6 remaining monarchs are located on foreign soil. 4 of these are in France. William I, who won the Battle of Hastings in 1066, founded England's Norman dynasty. However, he chose to be buried in his home country of Normandy. His tomb can be found at the Abbaye aux Hommes in the city of Caen. Richard I, also known as the Lionheart, died while fighting a war in France. He was buried at the Fontevraud Abbey in the Loire River Valley. His father, Henry II, is also buried there. James II died in exile in France after having been deposed in England. His body was kept at the Church of the English Benedictines in Paris, with the intent that it would eventually be returned to England. However, the church was plundered during the French Revolution, and the remains lost. George I was both King of England and, as head of the House of Hanover, an elector of the Holy Roman Empire. After his death, his body was returned to Hanover in Germany. It is currently interred on the grounds of the Herrenhausen Palace. Finally, there's Sven Forkbeard, a king of Denmark and Norway, who later also became King of England. After his death, his body was returned to Denmark. He was possibly buried in Roskilde Cathedral, but this is unconfirmed. So rest in peace, Queen Elizabeth II. To paraphrase J.R.R. Tolkien, you go now to your ancestors, in whose mighty company you shall have great honor. Long live the king. For more information on religious travel and pilgrimage, please visit my website at thecompletepilgrim.com. I also have several travel books available on Amazon: The Complete American Pilgrim, The Complete American Military Pilgrim, The Complete Jewish Pilgrim, and the award-winning The Complete Christian Pilgrim. These links can be found in the description.